Hello and welcome everyone to the next session of CME Palooza Fall. This session is called the CME Advice Columnists, and this session is sponsored by Integrity CME. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza Fall, and thank you for joining us. This is our 2 p.m. Eastern Time session, so we're about a little more than halfway through CME Palooza Fall. So before we begin this session, just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Genentech and Prova Education, our silver sponsors, ASIM, Forefront Collaborative, Global Academy for Medical Education, Integrity CE, and Practicing Clinicians Exchange. And then our bronze sponsors, ACHL, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Global Education Group, Helio.com Education Lab, Highmark CE, Infograph Bed, Connective, Primary Care Network, PVI, RMEI, and Thistle Editorial. So there are 3 ways to ask questions during this live session, as with all CME Palooza sessions. You can click on the link that is right above where you're watching this on our live page. For those of you who are watching this live, please click on the Scott Sessions link and you can ask whatever questions you want of our panelists. You can use our CME Palooza text line to send in your question. The number is 267-666-0CME, that's 0263. Or you can tweet your session. Tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. Folks have been asking lots of questions all through the day. It's been great using all 3 of these mechanisms. So we certainly hope that people will interact. We've got a lot of interesting topics that we're going to be talking about during this session. One final speaker disclosure slide, just so that you know the opinions, discussions, and conclusions of our speakers belong to them and not necessarily represent an endorsement or position of their employer, parent company, or affiliates. So I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Holly Kadkota, dressed as the Statue of Liberty here in a second. But this session is going to be a little bit different. So we've got a bunch of letters that were sent in by the CME community. That's to kind of speak to some of the issues that folks are facing. So this is sort of our Ann Landers / Dear Abby. I think it's a Dear Caroline, I believe, is sort of the latest iteration. So so Holly and this panel are going to run through a lot of the letters that were sent in and kind of hopefully offer some advice. So with that, let me turn it over to Holly Kadkota, and she will introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Scott, and maybe we should call this panel session Dear Lady Liberty. Welcome, everyone, to the inaugural CME Advice Columnist session. We have asked that you give us your grant portal tired, your compliance-fearing, huddled masses yearning for commendation, the wretchedly long outcomes reports from your year-long initiative. Send these CME beginners to us. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our panel. We've got Gabby Cruz, Director of Education from Physicians Education Resource. Gabby, could you please give us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks for having me today. I've got about 25 years of experience in strategic planning and implementation of educational activities in various formats in both for-profit, nonprofit settings, medical associations, and have also worked with expert faculty and building relationships and forging educational partnerships.
Thanks so much. Sarah Meadows, Accreditation Administrator at Denver Health Hospital. Sarah, would you mind giving us a bit about your experience with CME?
Sure. I've been in CE for about 15 years in both the MEC and hospital settings. And currently at Denver Health, I also get to work with our graduate education.
Great. Thank you so much. Glad to have you on the panel. Greg Salinas, Dr. Greg Salinas, the president from CE Outcomes. Greg, could you share some background about your experience with CME and CME Outcomes?
Sure. So yes, I've been at CE Outcomes for about 10 years. So have spent about 10 years looking at both good and bad outcomes reports, whether they're made by us or not, and other ways of really assessing the needs of different communities in the healthcare world.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. This should be very interesting. So as Scott mentioned, we received several questions to review today during our panel session. Let's get started with question number 1. Viewers can see this question. I'll summarize it. This one is from Dear CME Advice Columnists, this individual works in a hospital. One of the jobs is CME coordinator, and the boss is being Uber compliant, making this individual's job harder, and in this individual's belief, wasting time by requiring that there are certain documents and T's to be crossed, I's to be dotted with accreditation requirements. There's an example of obtaining new signed disclosure forms from the Education Committee every time they meet, rather than asking for updates if there are changes in disclosure information. This individual, checking all boxes, is very frustrated and is asking what of the panel, what we can give, what kind of advice can we give? So I'd like to turn it over to Sarah to answer this question initially, to maybe share with us some of your experiences in different academic centers.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Reading this, my first thoughts are either perhaps he or the program that he has supervised has gotten in trouble in the past, or he is just a very strict rule follower, or maybe it's a little bit of both. But I guess I might try to understand what has happened in the past. I think that might put everybody on the same playing field for understanding where he's coming from. And for myself, one of the things that has helped me is to go back and try to fully understand what the requirements actually are, because I have found that I can often modify things with my team to make things more efficient, not as arduous. And I think you could take the lead in that by making that a topic of discussion, maybe in some regular meetings that you have weekly, monthly. One of the great sources for that, the ACCME website, obviously has all the criteria listed there, but they also have a provider examples of compliance and non-compliance section. And you can search for those through the different criteria and also through keywords. I know there's multiple ways of finding that on the website, but if you go under the CME provider section, it's listed under resources. So I think that's a really helpful resource for you. And one other approach I might suggest is reaching out to peer institutions to find out what other folks are doing in similar with similar requirements, because that might help him to I guess feel better if he sees a trusted peer doing something around the same requirement, but in a different way and perhaps a more efficient way.
I think that those are all really great suggestions. I think especially being able to check in with other peer institutions might be able to provide this checking all boxes individual quite some documentation that they need to share with their supervisor. Gabby, what do you think? You know, in addition to the fact that there's all these processes in place, what do you think about the fact that maybe one of the issues is about the disclosure, specifically about the disclosure in this case?
Yeah, thanks. And so I think the other part of this is that perhaps the physician leader in this group doesn't really fully understand the standards for commercial support, because there is, excuse me, not just the requirement for disclosure, but also the requirement for resolution of any conflict of interest. And that's really not addressed in the question at all, or brought up in the question, but you have to wonder about, okay, well, it's great that they're giving the verbal disclosures, but then what do they do to resolve any conflict of interest? And really documenting that piece of it becomes integral to your documentation for your self-study and compliance down the road. And again, as Sarah mentioned, there are lots of resources on the ACCME website about types of methods for resolution of conflict of interest, and your organization may have or may need to set a policy for how that all happens and what involvement that particular faculty member may or may not have in the future if they do find that there is a COI.
That's a really a good point that you bring to the table here. Any other points that maybe we want to discuss here? Anything about maybe sharing or how best to communicate some of these changes or updates or better ways of managing to the physician leader? Sarah?
Not that I can think of. I think Gabby's point is helpful related to this specific instance that they cite about the disclosure information.
Great. I think the resources is really helpful with the guidelines on the ACCME as well. So that's great. So let's move on to question number 2, if everyone's ready. Question number 2 is a beginner's beginner. And for those of you reading this on your screens, you know that this is a high school friend who's recently helped this individual have a job at a small hospital she works at in the suburbs. One of the responsibilities is to serve as a CME coordinator. And she's a bit too embarrassed to ask about help or advice about CME. What's the best way that she can learn about CME without anyone finding out that she doesn't know anything about CME. So interesting scenario here, and we've all been beginners in this industry several years ago. So we know where this leads us, but I think that what's a good thing today is that there are a tremendous amount of resources. So maybe I'll turn it to Gabby. We kind of touched a little bit about it already in the last question, but Gabby, if you don't mind taking it on.
Sure. I'd be happy to start. So first of all, they're in the right place, right? They've come to CME Palooza and asked us a question, and that's a great venue for peer-to-peer education. So obviously CME Palooza has great archives. You can go back, and if you're looking for a particular topic or information there, that's a great place to start. And we're all in education and are dedicated to lifelong learning. And I know that that sounds cliche, but we say it for our physician learners and our healthcare professional learners. And so we should be too. So there's lots of opportunities on the Alliance website for education, whether you're a member or not. And then, you know, if you are so dedicated to CME, you could opt to become a certified professional, which is also information on the Alliance website. And then back to the sort of peer-to-peer point, you know, LinkedIn, I think, is a great resource. There are several groups dedicated to CME, and a few of them are very active. And there's nothing wrong with tapping somebody within this community and asking a question. It won't make you look stupid. It won't make you, you know, get fired from your job without knowing this information. So, you know, rely on the people that have been in this industry and know this information.
Indeed. I think that those are really good points to tap into your network, or even reaching out to a new network and learn from those individuals. Greg, any thoughts about, you know, being a beginner from an outcomes perspective? Like how,
yeah.
any
Yeah, you know, so I think not necessarily just from an outcomes perspective, but I mean, nobody is trained in any of this before they get into it. I mean, there's no degree in CME that you get, and then you're plugged into a CME coordinator role. So I think that the idea of, you know, asking for help, that has to be key. And you know, communication is the big part of this, and this goes with the previous question as well. Is just having these open dialogues about what it is that I'm expected to do. And what do I really need to do? And what are some of your experiences with this before? And you know, what did the previous person in this role do? And what did you want out of it? You know, I think just continuing those conversations within in-house and those external resources is very important.
Great points. Great points. So Sarah, what do you think?
I would want to mention too, state and regional alliances. I know in Colorado, we have a great state alliance that has CME folks at all different levels. And that, I mean, that continues to be a great resource for me to reach out with questions and learn new ways of doing things. There's, I know Texas has a great alliance, Illinois, there's the Mid-Atlantic Alliance. So finding some of those local opportunities keeps things at, you know, a smaller, maybe it's a less intimidating group, but they typically have a lot of expertise and a lot of resources.
Yeah, certainly. And let's not forget the annual meeting, which has some sessions that are specifically designed for the new CME industry individual who comes on board. So they can certainly tap into that and attend that session in live and, you know, collaborate with other individuals who are beginners as well. I think a friend of mine always used to call this industry and the people who worked within it as the island of misfit toys. So to Greg's point, you know, no one ever really goes to school to get a degree in CME education specifically. So that's all really great points, everybody. Thanks so much for your insights. Let's move on to question number 3. Okay. And this one is signed by, stuck on page 22, working for a mid-sized pharma company in the grant department and just needs to vent, having a really hard time with processing and reading through the 25+ pages of outcomes reports from the providers who fund these initiatives. They appreciate the data, so they say, but it seems to be a little bit over the top. So this individual is asking about how we can get the message across to providers that more outcomes don't necessarily mean better outcomes. I think that this is a great question. I've heard it from supporters myself, and I think we try to institute that a good summary of data is the best way to communicate to supporters. But maybe, Greg, we'll start with you. So what do you recommend?
Yeah, so this is a question that is more prevalent now than it certainly was when I first got started in this area. So, 10 years ago or so, we would have these big, what we called kind of doorstop reports where, we weren't, the amount of data wasn't quite as prevalent then. So you would get these big, thick reports of all the data that you did on your program and just plop it down on someone's desk and say, done. And things have changed. So I think that the education around outcomes has certainly improved. People are doing a much better job of collecting data. However, I'm not sure that they're doing a much better job of kind of understanding the data there and putting it in a framework that's really understandable for the supporters. So I think that the main thing here is that, well, number one, providers of education need to understand that people aren't going to read 25-page outcomes reports. There needs to be at least a one-page summary, whether it's a graphic summary or just kind of a bullet point highlights of what you did, what was accomplished, what are some of the main outcomes out of this. But I think, again, I'm going to go back to my previous statement. This is about communication, because I don't think it's out of the question to tell someone that, hey, I don't have a lot of time to read this. Can you summarize this for me? Can you give me an executive summary that can really, highlight your successes here with this program? And not that won't necessarily help them, but then these supporters can also push it up the ladder too to their bosses and really help them understand why they're doing this end in CME.
Yeah, I think that's really good insight there, Greg. And what do you think about maybe even different formats? I mean, it sounds like there's 25 pages that are being provided to these supporters. Is there any way to send it over, the information? Could it be a slide deck? Could it be, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think certainly we're doing most of our reports now in slides. That seems to be the main kind of avenue of communication now for a lot of these groups. So whether it's a few slides, again, some graphics, some just showing what you did, and you don't have to give a mess of data tables to really show how a program is working.
Yeah, and then this is to the panel. I just based on your experiences, have any of you ever been or asked a supporter to maybe give you 30 minutes or 15 minutes of time to walk through some of the highlights of the outcomes reports? And so maybe I'll turn that over to you, Gabby.
Yes, that is something that we've been doing. We, take this as an opportunity to touch base with the supporter and sort of close the loop, if you will. But the other thing that's great about it is that while your outcomes report may be technically the end of one activity, it really truly is the beginning of another. So it gives you an opportunity to potentially talk very generally about future education opportunities while you're summarizing what you learned from the activity that was funded.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point. What do you think, Sarah?
I was thinking about this from the standpoint of what's happening actually at the pharma company. And I wonder if this person is looking for some buy-in, perhaps from their own company as well, to maybe set a different standard for the type of outcomes reports that they expect. And I think they can do that by showing some really great examples of concise reports like Greg was talking about.
That's true. But have you, in your experience in the academic setting, ever presented any of the data that you've collected to the supporter directly?
I had a few opportunities several years ago with one supporter who came and actually asked me to share by webinar I think it was, like 6 to 12 slides, something fairly brief for a large quality improvement initiative, the highlights of it, so that other providers in the community, as well as others within the pharmaceutical company, could understand the highlights of it. And it was nice because it actually helped force you to get to the main ideas.
Right, right. That's great. And Greg, I know your organization, you partner with many of our providers, either the non-accredited and even the accredited providers. So are you invited to ever join a call with the provider or the partner to present some of the results?
Yeah, it does happen, especially if we can kind of take maybe a few different projects that we're doing within one provider and can roll them up together and really kind of talk about not just kind of a one-off activity, but maybe a few together to see how really they're making some change and some impact there with their education. So I think, it comes down to just make it as easy as possible for everyone. And, we heard earlier today about some of the myths of grant support. You don't want to give another reason why not to support something, make it as easy as you can for them in understanding your data. And so their job is easier too.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, what Sarah was talking about, like from the supporter standpoint, what information do they need to then demonstrate the success internally? So maybe even having a conversation with the supporter in very general terms, like what would resonate the most with your internal team, so that then we can come back with another grant for a phase 2. So I think all of these points were really well thought out. So thanks for your input on that. Everyone ready to move on to the next question? We're up to question number 4.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is signed by No Partner in Crime. For the last 2 months, this person's been working pretty much every day with the executive director of a small advocacy organization on a really comprehensive grant, and they're planning on submitting it later this month. They've been, this individual's been working with the internal team, but they're a small organization, and they've only had contact with this one person on the advocacy side. And recently, she received an email that just said that this individual at the advocacy organization is leaving her organization at the end of the week, but not to worry about the proposal. She'll bring everyone up to speed before she leaves. And naturally, our letter writer is very concerned that she's invested a lot of time, or she or he has been invested a lot of time in building the relationship and also the grant, and concerned that at this point they're now screwed. So what do you do? What do we do? I think that everyone has probably been in this person's shoes at one point or another, if not many times in our history, career history. Let's start with Gabby, just to hear about what your thoughts are.
Sure. Communication is really the key on this one at more than just the level of the two people who've been in contact with each other. So if there's anything that can be done to facilitate broader conversations with leadership, both at the advocacy organization as well as within the medical communications company agency, I think that goes a long way to solidifying that partnership before this person leaves. The other thing they may want to consider doing is actually drafting up a memorandum of understanding. While it's not a legal binding contract, it is something in writing that allows both organizations to commit to the partnership at some level, not financially usually, but at least with roles and responsibilities. So that way, obviously it takes a while for a grant to get approved. So even from the point of submission, if this person's leaving, you've got at least 2 months down the road before you know whether or not this initiative's been funded. And then that way you have something to fall back on that helps remind everybody of what the roles and responsibilities were going to be and what everybody agreed to before that staff person left.
I think that's a really great idea, especially the memorandum of understanding part, where you can, spell it out. It's quite official of a document. It's, more formal than back and forth emails. I think That's a really great point. Greg, what do you think? I mean, I'm sure you've been involved in long-term initiatives that there's many changing players.
Yeah. So I guess get to know more than one person at each place, but it is a challenge. Trying to make that interaction and connection between is probably a very tight relationship or a close relationship in there anyway to really get something like this going. So sometimes it is just please can I have a conversation, have a call with the next person. Let's set up, catch them up. I think again, communication is key.
Yeah, and I mean, I think even in addition to calls, if it's possible to meet in person and maybe even pay a visit at the advocacy organization to meet the next person who's replacing the departing individual, that might be the best way to handle this.
So there's actually a question that came in. I think this is kind of interesting. So so here's the question. So this is what this person's saying. This is so me. I am leaving my job in 2 weeks, and I don't know who is going to be my replacement. What do I tell the organizations that I have partnered with?
Yeah,
so that person is not at the advocacy organization. They are within maybe an agency setting or some other setting. Sound what it sounds like to you?
I am gathering, it's hard to say, but I'm gathering that they are either at, like, let's say a hospital or an advocacy organization.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're a one-person team or something like that. So I guess let's just say, how do you break the news to the folks you're partnering with that you are leaving your job and they're going to have to suddenly start dealing with someone else?
Yeah, it's a tough conversation to have, that's for sure. And maybe, Sarah, what do you think? I mean, if you're in your CME office and someone's leaving, how do you handle that?
I think you kind of have to, you have to find out who someone can contact in your absence. And then as best you can, get them up to speed on at least some of the basics of what have been going on until someone is, I'm assuming they would be hiring and just perhaps haven't done it yet. But there has to be someone to be fielding phone calls, emails, whatever, in your absence. You can also only do so much, but keeping your files as up to speed as you can, making sure someone knows exactly where to find everything. I mean, it's nice that this person cares enough about what they've been doing even as they're leaving. Sometimes that's not the case. So I guess leaving kind of a trail of as much information as possible so that when that replacement comes in, they have a easier onboarding.
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether maybe this individual who just sent in the situation here, Scott, might even make themselves available after they depart, if their new position allows them to at least, connect, or maintain a relationship. I think that might be another way just to kind of keep the momentum going. I'm sure they might find someone internally at the organization and redirect them upon a rehire. So that might be another thing, another way to handle it. Any thoughts, Greg?
No, it's a tough one. I think it's, obviously they would probably report to someone. So just, make sure you document everything. Just do the best job of laying out what's going on right now. Even if you don't know that person, just, write it down, put it in a drawer somewhere, hopefully that they'll find it.
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether there might be even an opportunity to just wrap up the project sooner rather than later so that the grant's completed and submitted before this individual leaves the office. So that's maybe something else to kind of expedite the timeline if possible. It seems like if you've gone down this road so far, you may be close to the end, and then having it submitted or even ready to be submitted upon departure would be a good solution there. But then documenting some of the next steps, so upon grant award, then what is expected of the partner organization is really going to be quite critical for the new people to recognize what has to be done at that point. Any other questions, Scott?
That's the only one we had with that scenario.
Okay, great. So I think we're ready, unless there's other comments from the panel. Maybe moving on to question number 5. Yep. Okay. This is signed by, we're totally screwed. So this MEC just received notice that they're on probation from ACCME, and they believe that the rationale for the probationary status is a bit weak, but that's not the point. They're on probation, and pretty soon everyone who they're going to be applying to is going to find out about it. How do we get out of this hole? So interesting sort of situation. I'm sure it happens many, many times, especially as accredited providers are audited quite frequently. So Sarah, let me start with you this time. What do you think about how you would handle this?
Well, I don't think they're screwed. I think they're on probation, which is not ideal, but there's plenty of opportunity to turn that around. Accreditation status is public, so I would recommend getting out in front of it. We are in industry of continuous improvement. So demonstrating solid plans for how, I think it's a MEC, how your MEC would continue to improve is a way to respond positively, I think, in this situation. One way to do this, some of my fellow panelists and I were talking about this, you might prepare a notice for partners and stakeholders to briefly explain why your organization is on probation, and then outline the plans that you have in place to move in the right direction. And, perhaps most importantly, making sure that your team is on board with that plan. And as soon as possible, begin incorporating some of those practices for improvements into your setting, because the ideal situation is when the progress report is submitted, which I'm guessing is within a year or so of being put on probation status, that you have a lot of documentation of things that you have done, things that are already in place that improve your program. And one other thought on this is you maybe would designate a champion of sorts of this new process, not only to make sure that things are being done, these things are happening, but also to be able to jump in if there's a process that's not working, so that you can correct it quickly and keep moving in the right direction.
Well said. Sarah, Gabby, would you like to add to any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think Sarah summarized it wonderfully. I do know that before you actually get probationary status, you do have the opportunity to have progress reports before you get that sort of label put on you. So I think taking a good hard look at what your practices and your processes are internally that caused the noncompliance issue is really key. Transparency, as Sarah said, is certainly best because it is public information. And then, beyond that, making sure that everybody on your staff is on board with whatever changes need to be made. Because I think, one bad apple certainly spoils the bunch. And if there's somebody that's not on board with those changes or isn't implementing things the way that they should be, then that's a different type of issue you have to deal with internally.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I would just agree with everyone. The gut reaction with anything like this is to try to oh no, hide it. No one can know about this. But I think if you try to do something like this, especially if you have some minor infractions, everyone's going to think the worst. So if you say that, okay, well, this is what's going on, this is how we're going to remedy this, and be again open and communicate well about what's going on. I don't see that this is a major problem. It's a problem, but it's something that I think people can understand.
Yeah, I think so. Everyone on the panel, thanks so much for your suggestions here. Your points are really well taken. You're recommending that they become forthcoming, that they institute some checks and balances to ensure that the issue doesn't happen again. Even maybe communicating to stakeholders about what the situation was and how they're rectifying the situation. I like what Gabby, what you were saying as well, that maybe this is a training opportunity for internal staff, really taking advantage of reviewing some of the ACCME guidance and internally, because if you don't breathe it day in, day out, you lose it. So thanks so much for everybody. That's really good suggestions there. Let's move on to the next question. This is question number 6. Okay, so this individual is responsible for writing short outcomes assessments for their member or association. They're not a statistician, but believes that they have a pretty good handle on how to compare pre- and post-test results, as well as summarize learner responses, and perhaps put together a meaningful outcomes report. Hopefully it's short. But now they're getting to the point where they would like to be a little bit more comprehensive without getting sucked into the vortex of statistics and p-values. So any suggestions for baby steps that they could take that could bolster their data analysis skills without making them turn into a numbers geek? And this is signed by I flunked 11th grade calculus. Greg,
Sure.
Let's start with you here.
So first of all, there's nothing wrong with being a numbers geek. Second of all, I would say that you're probably doing a fine job. I think that, we don't need to have every outcomes report, with regression analyses and multivariate analyses and predicting all these different, multinomial equations. I think the ultimate role of an outcomes report is to tell the story. tell the story about what happened, what were the successes, what were maybe some of the weaknesses, what are you going to do better next time, here's what we're going to do. I think that if you get that, if you put together the qualitative with the quantitative, which it looks like they think they're doing a pretty good job on, I think that's it. I think that will be very important. If you go back, to that question we had a few minutes ago, if you can do it in a way that's a one page or a couple slide interpretation of what's going on, I think that's all you need to do. I worry sometimes as we're getting a little bit more sophisticated in outcomes research that we're being a little too numbers heavy and hiding some things behind statistics and coming up with a p-value that explains everything. Well, maybe it doesn't. And I worry that we're over reliant a bit on statistics now. So tell the story. You can certainly dive into some online education. There's some Coursera programs. There's Khan Academy. There's ways to kind of bolster your stats knowledge so you feel more comfortable with what you're saying. But I would recommend not worrying too much about that.
Yeah, I think that's really a good point as far as not recommending and not worrying so much about the statistics part of it. But what do you think about adding any other elements to maybe their outcomes reports beyond the statistics to make it much more meaningful? I mean, beyond pre and post and summarizing what the evaluation results are there any other ways that this person can make the report really salient? Can there be testimonials, maybe from a thought leader or even maybe from a participant?
Absolutely. It does sound like they have some learner verbatims, for instance, some of that qualitative data that they could put some quotes in. So you have maybe a point showing some change pre-post, and then maybe a couple points saying that maybe why they're making that change or what specifically they're doing in their practice to do that. So having those kind of those user reports a bit about what it is that they like out of this education and how they're really using it in a day-to-day level, I think that's pretty powerful.
Great. Gabby, what do you think?
Yeah, and along those lines, I mean, they are a member organization, so I don't know what the structure is or what kind of committees they have, but of course the larger associations all have education committees at some level. Even smaller ones have at least one person who's designated as the education representative. So having that person do somewhat of the storytelling and trying to piece together the information from pre and post to tell at least a short story about what kind of impact they were able to have with the education will go a long way, especially obviously if it's a member association where they're physician members.
Sure, good point. What do you think, Sarah?
Well, I was taking notes because this is a good question. I've had some of those questions myself, but I know, some of our activities, some of our quality performance improvement activities. I've also worked closely with some of our research faculty that are more well-versed in the p-value world. If I felt I needed to include some of that, maybe in a poster presentation, things like that. So that's been helpful.
Yeah, all good points indeed. Sorry, my points are.
And if you don't happen, just going back, if you don't happen to have all this, nice statistics software on your computer, there are online calculators for everything you want to do. So if you know the particular thing you want to run, just type it into Google and you'll find just an online platform that will do that for you.
Right, good suggestion. And so we've got some, what points for what you can do as a next step to make it much more meaningful, how you can not necessarily get wrapped up into statistics, maybe check in with some of your education committee members or maybe some other thought leaders just to hear about where we can include other information to make it a much more robust report.
So there is one question that came in, but first of all, I have to say I love how Holly keeps moving her computer, but the light always shines on Lady Liberty. No matter where you go, the sunshine is following you.
That's something.
But here's the question. The question that came in is, but how do you know whether going to even understand the additional statistical information that you are including in your grant report?
Sorry, you cut out. How do you know who will?
How do you know the grantor who is going to be receiving the outcomes report, if this is a funded program, is even going to understand some of the statistical information that you presumably may want to add or include in the outcomes report to them?
Yeah, I think that goes back to my point, is that don't rely too much on those statistics. You want to tell the story. If you're telling the story, it should be clear. You have the statistics to back that up. You have the data to back that up, but don't rely on those numbers to tell the story. You know the story and tell that. Again, think of it as you're telling the story, not you're presenting a math problem.
Okay, great.
And also, I think we talked a little bit about this with the last question. Maybe if you have an opportunity to speak to the supporter about what's relevant for their internal presentations, maybe just asking, in addition to the story, are there any points that would really resonate, depending upon who they're presenting to? I mean, maybe they need to have some more information about a specific audience type that participated in an activity. So then there's some input that they can gain and really provide a meaningful report. Any other thoughts from the panel on this one?
I think it's clear. Just going back to my earlier statement, is that sometimes when I see things that are a little math heavy, I just worry that you're covering something else. So don't worry about it.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Let's move on to the next question from Princess Leia. Those of us who love Star Wars, and we do. Okay. Boy, did I screw up, and I mean really screw up. This individual, Princess, submitted a grant to the Dark Side Pharmaceuticals and was approved for the pig lizard flu activity. So they started, dancing like a Wookiee with lice, kind of gross, if you ask me, and singing the Yub Nub song. That's great. But in their excitement and in their haste, they forgot to have the COO sign the LOA, and now the conference is over. The funds have been expended, and they have an unsigned LOA on file. What do they do now? What if the program is selected for ACCME audit? Oh, no. Sarah, what do you think? Let's have you tackle this one first.
Sure. I will echo what I said in the probation question, which is to get out in front of this. And in this situation, it would be documenting what happened in the activity file. So what happened, why it happened, and then the process or plan that your organization has to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And then most importantly, to follow through with that process. If that activity is selected by the ACCME, then you have documentation in your file showing that what happened, the things that you were going to do to improve the situation, and then you will have multiple activities to show different ways that you implemented that new process and didn't have the situation happen again. So I think if you can show that this is an isolated issue with a resolution versus a pattern, then you're okay. And generally having an action plan, going back to that, getting out in front of it, generally having an action plan without needing the ACCME to come back and tell you to have an action plan is ideal.
Well said. I see you nodding over there, Gabby. What do you think? You agree?
Well, I mean, it's not exactly parallel because this is more of an excitement issue where the person got so excited they forgot to have the COO sign the LOA. We actually, in my past, had a situation where due to basically a natural disaster, it was Superstorm Sandy. We were coming up on our annual meeting, and we were literally within a week of that meeting and had a last-minute grant approved. And we got notice of the approval. We signed our part and returned it to them. And then the next day, pretty much everyone was out of their offices in New Jersey for upwards of 10 days. And we did everything within our power. I mean, I was on my cell phone calling people. They couldn't get into their office. Their computers were all down. But, it's a natural catastrophe. I mean, you can't, hold somebody personally responsible for not having that signature in place absolutely before the event. And we documented it pretty much minute by minute, phone call by phone call for our files. And that was literally the only LOA that we didn't get signed, like in our entire accreditation period. So thankfully it was not, the activity itself was pulled in our accreditation review. However, we didn't get cited for non-compliance because we had documented the whole instance of it. And we're all human and natural catastrophes happen. So again, it's part of like what Sarah was saying, to make sure that it's not something that's going to happen over and over again, because then you do have to take a good hard look at all your processes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too to bring up again, and I think your experience does shed some light that the documentation was really what saved you from having the file be audited. And again, it could be an opportunity for training internally, like if this happened, and we all understand excitement about grant awards because it's so painful of a process to be able to obtain the grant. So, you can get carried away, especially if you have a Wookiee nearby. Greg, any thoughts you'd like to tag on here?
Yeah, I think they covered it pretty well. I think if you document it, you use it as a learning process. As the audit comes and sees that's already happened, and if you're ahead of it, I think it happens.
Great. All right then, folks. I think we're ready to move on to our next question, which is a final question that we've received and kind of gone through and prepared for, although there might be additional questions coming through at this moment. This one is our no thank you, Dr. Jerkwad, that is. At a recent live program, one of the faculty presenters hit on me, not me, but the writer, like without a doubt hit on me. It made me really uncomfortable, and I'm not trying to laugh it off, but you laughed it off as no big deal. To me, it is a big deal, and it is a big deal, and I don't want to work with this guy ever again. Should I say something to someone, and if so, what should I say, and who should I tell? Okay, so, we all as a panel reviewed this question, and firstly, we just wanted to say that this is, of course, a very important issue. This happens across industries, as everyone on the panel discussed previously when we were reviewing the question, and that I'll turn it over to the panel. I think unanimously we all agreed that, what do you think, Sarah?
I think it's an issue for HR. It is important, but I don't think it's a CME issue. I think it's a HR issue.
Agreed. Gabby?
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, it does happen, and the best way to handle it is to mention it to somebody who can connect you with your HR people, especially if you're on site and at a meeting somewhere. Obviously, you're not in your office environment, but this is important enough to reach that person and bring it to their attention. True.
And also maybe even come up with a plan of action for how you might be able to be reassigned if there's, future activities involving Dr. Jerkwad, and how you might be able to handle it moving forward. And documenting, again, we're back to the documentation. Greg, any thoughts?
No, communication with HR.
Yep. So we all agree, unanimous decision here. So we're sorry that this happened. It's very important that you do take it to HR, though. And
So what if you are, I'm an independent contractor. I don't have an HR department. Not that this necessarily happened to me, but what if that's not an avenue of potential, attack for this? Let's say that you're just having to deal with this on your own, without any support from other staff members. Any thoughts on that? I know that's kind of a even more difficult position.
Yeah, it certainly becomes even more of a difficult situation. I mean, I think at that point I might tap into my network of maybe attorneys in the neighborhood where I could get some free counsel about how to handle it if I was an independent contractor, how to document it again, and maybe even what's the best way to communicate it with somebody who's making an uncomfortable and hostile sort of work environment. I don't know whether, Sarah or Gabby or Greg, you've got any thoughts about that for the individual who's an independent contractor. How would you recommend they handle it?
It's a difficult conversation, but I think if this person could approach it as, hey, I'm not sure what your intent was with our interaction at this recent event, but here's how it impacted me, and I felt a little uncomfortable, and maybe we can talk about that.
Gabby?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just sort of tackling it head on is really going to be your best choice if you are an independent contractor. And And then, ultimately, if you have choice of which physician to work with, then maybe that's an opportunity to change who you're working with.
And also, if you're an independent contractor, maybe even speaking to the individual who's hired you for that position to make them aware that this situation has happened, and maybe asking, recommending, seeking the opportunity to not necessarily be working with this individual again, because it's not something, maybe they even have an HR that you could tap into for some guidance if you're working as a freelancer. Greg?
Yeah, I guess all of that is great. I just wonder about the physician's institution as well. Is that an opportunity to, do you go there? I don't know. And again, it's more complicated when you're independent and you're on your own. And certainly, my guess would be this wouldn't be the first time he would have done this, and it probably won't be the last unless something's done. So I would recommend you do have to stand up.
It's almost like we need a Sunshine Act for these types of physicians. Just a place to be able to document them, right? Public offenders. Well, thank you to the panelists. And Scott, unless there's other questions that we need to answer, I see that Scott wants us to respond to some surveys. Survey posted that's up there.
Yes. So there is, for folks who are watching this session, either live or the recorded version, there is a brief survey on the CME Palooza Fall live page, short survey to get a sense of what you're watching, who you are, and to kind of help us plan for future iterations of CME Palooza. For those of you who are watching this live, you will need to refresh your browser to watch our next session, our 3 p.m. Eastern Time session, which is all about outcomes. And once this session concludes, and with that, I'd like to thank Sarah and Greg and Gabby and the Statue of Liberty, Holly Kadkota. Apparently, this is costume day at CME Palooza. This is our second session, so I think we're setting a new standard for the future. So, thank you to everyone for joining us, and we will see you all soon.